This is episode 395 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Darren Freebury Jones, lecturer in Shakespeare Studies at the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
In All's Well That Ends Well, a character is described as that with a plume, 'tis a most gallant fellow. And in Love's Labour's Lost, the Princess of France mockingly asks, what plume of feathers is he that indited this letter? Revealing how feathers could both elevate and satirize their wearer. Feathers might seem like a simple decoration today, but in the 16th and early 17th centuries, feathered clothing, especially feathered hats, spoke volumes about a person's status, identity, and even their participation in the expanding global economy. To better understand the culture behind feathers in clothing for Shakespeare's lifetime, we're sitting down this week with Professor Ulinka Rublack, whose article, Befeathering the European, investigates the history of feathers in clothing to help us explore where those feathers come from, what they looked like, and how they were used. Ulinka Rublack is professor of early modern history at Cambridge University and a fellow of St. John's College. She is a fellow of the British Academy and has won multiple prizes for her work. Ulinka is currently writing a global history of fashion from the Middle Ages to the Enlightenment. You can find out more about her and her work in the show notes for today's episode. Before we get started today, I'd like to extend an invitation. You are invited to join us inside That Shakespeare Society, where you can explore the research vault, not only for today's episode, but for our entire archive. Visit CassidyCash.com/episode 395 and click Access the Extras to browse the maps, artifacts, paintings, and primary documents, all related to our conversation today, and you can explore these extras while you listen to the show. And now, let's dive into the history. Hello, Ulinka. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Hello, Cassidy. Thank you very much for the invitation to talk to you today.
Were feathered hats primarily for men or women in Shakespeare's lifetime?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say probably for both, but we tend to think of it more as something for women. And that starts later, that it gets feminized as a fashion. But in that period, for sure, men would have worn as many feathers as they were able to.
Well, which animal feathers were most popular for use in clothing when they're wearing these hats? What kind of feathers are they using?
So it depended on your status. You could just take a cockerel feather if you didn't have any money, or pluck, whatever bird came past your way. But of course, what they were really looking for were ostrich feathers or even heron feathers. We have to say that this is all quite a new fashion that starts off in the 16th century. So the Middle Ages, we see one or two feathers sometimes being used. But the key point here is that this culture was really inspired what they saw about the Americas. So the Aztecs, in particular the Incas, great feather cloaks. They heard about those, and that is what inspired them. But of course, they didn't have access to these great exotic feathers. What they used were ostrich feathers in the main.
Was there any cultural significance to the number of feathers that someone wore in a hat? Did more feathers mean more status or perhaps more vanity?
Yes, certainly vanity to an extent, but also we have to definitely see that this is something that gets layered up. I mean, we might perhaps get later into just, how this is achieved, but certainly when I think about myself, I used to think that when I saw an ostrich feather in the images of the period or read it referred to, say, in Shakespeare's plays, that they talk about one feather. But in fact, this is a layering of plumes that are sewn onto each other, often in layers of 5. So in that sense, to have a properly befeathered man, as they start to say in that period, you would need quite a few plumes to make a real impression.
Were feathers ever thought to have any protective, spiritual, or maybe even superstitious qualities in early modern Europe? I know lots of things were often superstitious in this time period, but were they just purely decorative or did they have other worldly qualities as well?
Yeah, definitely protective. I mean, this goes back, of course, to antiquity in Europe. And it's actually interestingly convergent around different cultures in the world where military usages are then associated with this, with long feathers in particular. And, we see it in references to Hector and his flashing red helmet. So these kinds of feathers protect because they produce awe. And hence that interest in, the long layered plumes, for instance. So spiritual, that's of course in Mesoamerican cultures that, there was really a sense of people turning into birds, taking on bird-like qualities. What we know for Shakespeare's time is that interestingly, for men and women, the use of feathers is often associated with lovers and also with musicians as well. So we have the military, lovers, and musicians. And in each case, the qualities of feathers relate to something quite distinctive there, also as a sensibility, we might say.
Were there any stereotypes assigned to men who wore feathers in their hats? I know in Shakespeare's plays, there's often referred to, that guy with feathers or something. So was there some kind of special significance or a social impact of being someone who had a feathered hat?
Again, I would say it depended, just what that feather was and how it was worn. And again, how, you have to imagine these things, of course, is really influencing how someone moved. I mean, there was something quite grand about a larger hat with a long or even several feathers on. I mean, I teamed up with the London School of Historical Dress, Jenny Romani, to reconstruct one of these almost like feather crowns that were worn in the round and attached on a wire frame to a hat in the 16th century. So that would have created great visibility and made a real impression.
Not to mention just your ability to wield this, because I imagine that's no small feat to walk around with something pretty large on your head.
Absolutely. It's interesting to handle feathers. I mean, I think feathers are one of these materials we're slightly lost touch with, and there is a real sensation to, their incredible lightness, of course. I mean, even when you layer them up and put them together, they still weigh nothing. And I think that is what explains some of that association with, interestingly, then creativity itself, as with the musicians, and a kind of lightness and spirit, a delicacy. They were often associated with that. And of course, if you moved your head, they would all, register your own movement. So it's almost like they become part of your expression. And I think that's also what explains the association with lovers, that sensibility there.
Robert Greene famously called Shakespeare an upstart crow, beautified with our feathers. What is it about the cultural and social identity of feathers that made this a particularly effective insult in this moment of history?
Yeah, I mean, it obviously relates to that common saying that, you decorate yourself with someone else's feathers, which of course wearing, you don't have feathers. So it's a funny kind of conceit. So what he was evidently saying is that he thought Shakespeare was drawing on the achievement of other people, and then it becomes incongruous, doesn't it, through that evocation of a crow, so very lowly bird, very different from the revered ostrich in this case.
Are you enjoying the history you're learning, but would love to go even deeper into the archives and get a behind-the-scenes look at this week's show? Come inside the Research Vault with members of That Shakespeare Society, where you can browse all our studio research for this week's show, plus some extras from our guest. Join us at CassidyCash.com/episode 395 and click Access the Extras to dive in. Well, where did the feathers come from? You're talking about ostrich feathers and heron feathers being the most prized. I mean, were people raising ostriches there in England, or were they importing these from somewhere else? And if so, where?
Yeah, that's a fascinating history. It's not very easy to track down in huge amount of detail, but there's no doubt about it that ostriches couldn't be raised in Europe. In fact, there were some that were paraded on show, but most people would have never seen an ostrich. And one of the funny things is that the great compiler of information about animals, Conrad Gesner, who publishes a book about animals in the mid 16th century, he actually thought that ostriches had colorful feathers in green and red and so on because he'd never seen one and he'd only seen the ostrich feathers dyed. So, of course, they have a brown, a white, or black feathers, depending on male, female, and they were very skillfully hunted in Northern Africa. So that's super interesting because, the scale of demand grew exponentially in the 16th and 17th centuries because they went to Europe, they went to the Ottoman Empire, so what we think of as Turkey, and they were also increasingly then exported to Latin America. So there must have been a real growth in this hunting culture. These ostriches, were wild. They were not domesticated before. They were farmed in South Africa, of course, then much later. So they were strong birds, very muscular. And yeah, this was a lucrative trade. And, you can just see from shipping them, via the Barbary coast to Venice, how much they were valued. It was big business.
Well, who would have been making these hats in Shakespeare's England? Were they sold already decorated with these dyed feathers, or did people purchase sort of plain hats and then add the plumage to their particular preference?
Yes, they would have first got their hat made, purchased it ready made, and then they would have gone to the feather maker. And I mean, in line with what I've just outlined, we can see that these feather makers really become a big trade only in the 16th century in many European cities. So you would go and have this done bespoke and according to your individual budget.
Well, what kinds of techniques were they used? You were mentioning that they're dyeing these feathers, but were they also cleaning them or maybe, altering them, trimming them or something to make them appear more luxurious? What was the process of taking it from the ostrich to putting it on one of these hats, which the portraits that I've seen of men with these large plumed hats, I understand Conrad Gessner's confusion there because they are often wild colors that you wouldn't see naturally on an ostrich. So what did it look like to turn an ostrich feather into something like that?
Yeah, so you would have to bleach them often, and to make them real white, you would have to bleach them and fume them. And what's also absolutely fascinating when you recreate this, so as I had the experience of doing when I was at the London School of Historical Dress, and is that of course they are made up from keratin, so they behave very much like hair. So in other words, when you dye them, you wash them, as it were, and in dye, you expose them to water. And afterwards, they flop. And what is quite difficult is that you then have to restore in a kind of blow dry process. You have to restore volume back to them from just flopping down. And there, the real mystery question is just how exactly they did so, because you clearly needed an airflow, much as with blow dryers today, or some fan. And then you needed to constantly stroke them, move them again, like as with a brush, in order to then bring them back to life. And that is quite a skill and takes quite a while. And then, I mean, the real ultimate way of using them was not only to cut into these very hard shafts and then to sew them together, which is difficult work. It was also to do something that would have been very familiar to Shakespeare, and that was bespangling them. So spangles are these tiny metal plates of something shiny like brass. They look imitate gold, and they would be sometimes individually, wired. I mean, it sounds crazy because these barbules, the little parts of the feathers, they're very fragile, but you could actually use a kind of wire frame around it and then attach these brilliantly sparkling spangles onto them, or just attach them in some other way. So there was clearly a desire to further amplify them. And again, those spangles would have moved with you, not only the feather, but also the spangle. So it really is quite a spectacle.
Obviously, there's a lot of history to unpack here about the history of feathers in hats and fashion for Shakespeare's lifetime, from where they're coming from to what influenced them. What should we start with? If we are excited about the history of feathers and want to explore this subject further, where would you suggest we begin?
In many ways, I would suggest we start with the Florentine Codex. So, this is really, in many ways, where all this takes off. It is when Europeans in the Spanish Empire and through the goods that come back from the Spanish Empire just see what can be done with feathers. I mean, we find Cesare Vecellio, who wrote around 1600 a big book compiling with 500 woodcuts, what appearances were worn in the world. We find that he says from Venice, the most extraordinary dress ever created are these feather cloaks. So that shaped Europe, that experience.
We will definitely look into that. And Ulinka has also provided links to her work and other open access sources on the history of feathers in the 16th century that we will link to in the show notes for today's episode. So make sure you go there to find these resources. Now, Ulinka, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible. So your choice would be in addition to those.
As a historian, I would choose my probably all-time favorite book, and it is by Fernand Braudel, and it's called The Mediterranean. And for me, it's such a classic, wonderful book that shows how interconnected that world already was. That is within the Mediterranean, but of course also to Northern Africa, as we've seen, relevant for the ostriches, whom he actually does mention. And it's always just an extraordinary read that shows us that even England was, of course, connected to the Ottoman Empire, that was part of so much bigger worlds, and of course beginning to be a colonial power. So we need to really think about how those worlds shaped European experiences in turn and could inspire them too with their crafts traditions.
Entertaining your favorite interests and providing a resource for always learning more is definitely a good choice. So what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
I'm just finishing a global history of dress and appearances between the early Middle Ages and the 18th century. So I'm very excited about that. It's going to be called The Triumph of Fashion. And I wanted to show just how we need to think about the history of fashion in that period as very, globally interconnected and as absolutely relevant for our understanding of the modern world and how it came about.
Exciting project for sure. We'll look forward to seeing that. Ulinka Rublack, thank you so much for being here this week and taking us through this history of feathers and how we should think about the fabulous plumes that show up in both Shakespeare's plays and the resources from his time period. Thank you so much for joining us to share it with us.
Thank you, Cassidy.
Just a quick reminder, you can find more about our guest, access the resources mentioned in today's show, and explore related episodes by visiting the show notes at CassidyCash.com/episode 395. While you're there, click Access the Extras to log in or join us as a member and explore this week's exclusive bonus content inside the Research Vault, including historical documents, paintings, portraits, museum artifacts, and visual materials connected to today's show. Again, that link is CassidyCash.com/episode 395. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.